Has your know-it-all friend told you you need to strip and grease that bike? Do you even know what the heck that means? Do you know what all these different greases do or where they even go? Well, if not, stick around. I'm going to show you, so don't panic. Grease effectively acts as a buffer between two surfaces, so it can stop them rubbing together and wearing out. It can also create a bit of a barrier to stop water and dirt getting in, which can also lead to stuff wearing out. But grease isn't just for bearings and moving parts. Metal has a habit of seizing together, especially if it's subjected to wet and mucky conditions. But even carbon, if that dries out, it can end up having that horrible clicking noise. And to be honest, if it's not greased up properly, you might not be able to torque those components correctly, and they can end up loosening over time. So grease helps things run smoothly, it helps you torque things up correctly, it protects, and it also prolongs the life of your parts and your bike. So what's not to like? So where do these greases go? Well, basically anywhere where two surfaces contact each other. So that could be a seat post in a seat tube, it could be handlebars in a stem, that sort of thing. Now, there are some specialist greases out there if you've got two opposing materials working together, but more on that a bit later. I'm going to start with the basics, and I'm going to be using a standard bicycle assembly grease, which should just be a medium viscosity. So let's get started. Threads especially love grease, especially when it's metal on metal. And even though it seems like a really tight tolerance, we always seem to get mud and water creeping in there. So if you've got a common bicycle assembly grease, that will be absolutely fine on threads. But if you fancy specializing a little bit, especially if you have metal on metal, then you might want to use something like this, which is often referred to as an anti-seize compound. And that will just add as a little buffer between two metals that could react together. It's a good idea to take your pedals out, clean them up and re-grease them periodically, maybe once or twice a year at least, because it does keep them from building up any residue and then being difficult to change in the future. But also that build-up can make them difficult to put in, and that could lead to cross-threading in the future as well. And finally, there's bearings. So things like your hub, your bottom bracket, your headset, maybe even your pedals. They'll all have bearings in there, and they'll need grease to keep rolling smoothly. Now, we have done more in-depth servicing videos on things like bottom brackets and headsets, which I'd advise you to look at if you want to do a full service on your bike. But for a periodic strip and grease, all we're doing here is maybe taking those bearings out, giving them a good clean and greasing them up so that we can protect them from water and dirt ingress, which will hopefully prolong their life in the future. Now, you can get away with one grease for most jobs. I used a bicycle assembly grease on most of the jobs I just performed previously, but there are other specialist greases out there. And while this can seem like a way to sell you more things, they are specialist for a reason. So grease is oil-based, and this is how we lubricate and protect the components. But it is mixed in with different levels of thickener, and this can make them better or worse for different jobs. So for example, you wouldn't want a really thick grease in a fast rolling hub, because this could bog it down. It may even stop it working altogether. Equally, you wouldn't want to use a really runny grease or even a spray grease when you're trying to assemble a stem and handlebars, as it could be just really messy, but also it might not create a good enough buffer to torque up your components correctly. It may also be tempting to go outside the bicycle industry and get other greases from the hardware store, but if you're not familiar with what greases react with what materials, then I would stick with bike-specific greases, as some greases can have things like petroleum in them, which is really bad for carbon, and PTFE as well is arguably not great either. So do stick with bike-specific greases and do read the labels to see if it says carbon safe. So something like this speed grease, or other brands might refer to it as a high performance grease, is effectively like an assembly grease, but it's much more viscous, which means it's a lot runnier. It's not great for assembling parts, but it is really good in places like hubs and bottom brackets, as it'll help those things run a lot faster. So it may save you a few watts if you're a racer, but they can be more expensive, so maybe not go for that if saving pennies instead of watts is more important to you. So maintenance sprays and things like this PT17 or perhaps lithium greases and anything on the really runny side of greasing is probably better suited for driving out grime and water. And it can be really useful for spraying in your outer cables to protect and lubricate your inner cables, perhaps in little hard to reach areas like the clasps on your pedals, as it will drive itself in and help protect those surfaces when they're rubbing together. However, I don't tend to use this a whole lot, although I would recommend it for anyone out there that does have a carbon frame that has inner cable routings, as you can spray this down into those cable routings and it will prevent your outer cables from jamming in there in the future. Some different metals can react together and then be more likely to seize. So if you have a bike that has opposing metals, perhaps titanium bolts in a steel frame or steel bolts in an aluminium frame, then you might want to invest in some copper grease. Now, copper is a non-reactive metal, which means it'll act as a buffer between those two metals and hopefully prevent them from seizing. If you have a carbon frame or perhaps carbon components like a handlebar and stem, then you may want to invest in a grippy carbon grease. So something like this, which has a really fine measure of pumice particles in there, which has a really gritty feel. Some of the greases might have silica in there, and that effectively increases the friction between the two parts. So this will stop slippage, which is obviously a safety feature, but those tiny little movements do create those really annoying creaks from things like handlebars and stems anyway. So if you're experiencing that, it's time to invest in something like this. But this added friction also helps you sometimes reach a lower torque setting on your components, which is safer for the life of your carbon. But also, if you already have quite a low torque setting on your components, you might find it difficult to reach that without having slippage. So something like a max grip will help you reach the recommended torque setting much easier. Now, technically, thread locker isn't a grease, although it does provide a good buffer between two surfaces, particularly for threads, which is where it should be used, and it's designed to hold them in place and stop them unwinding over time. Now, you may have experienced these often on the bolts for your disc brake rotors. You'll find that they'll probably be hard to drive in and hard to unwind, and that's the thread locker doing its job. So what you want to bear in mind is not to use grease with the thread locker, as this will stop it working. And just a final word on suspension greases, because there's a real array of different greases out there designed for suspension. But what I will say to you is to stick with your manual for your specific suspension, stick with it to the letter, whatever brand or model they suggest using, or consult a specialist, because they can be really different. So for example, you can get really runny suspension greases like this one, which you can use on your wiper seals in order to just overcome that initial stiction in the first part of your stroke. But equally, you can get really, really thick greases that are designed to go inside, and they will be thick because they need to stay in place and not drop down and mix with the oils in your lowers, for example. So if you're not sure of what you need to use, then leave it to the experts. So grease helps things work better, run more quietly and smoothly, and it also protects things and helps prevent them wearing out too quickly. So this is where a strip and grease comes into play, because if you can periodically take off things like pedals and perhaps axles, that sort of thing, and clean them up and get them re-greased and put back in, then it's going to make your overall bike run quieter, better, and last a lot longer. So there you have it. Now you know a strip and grease is literally just taking a few important parts off your bike, like pedals, seat post, maybe the forks and the headset as well, to give them a good clean and a re-grease. And hopefully I've helped you be more confident with choosing the right grease in the future as well. So if you're a regular strip and greaser, let me know down in the comments below. Tell me, how often do you do it on your bike, and help out the future GMBN community.